In the quiet suburb of Oak Valley, a husband's dark betrayal is about to backfire spectacularly. For 50 years, Eleanor Thompson has been the picture of a devoted wife. That's exactly why her husband Charles thought she'd be the perfect victim. Working with their neighbor, Margaret, he's been carefully poisoning Eleanor's daily tea, planning their new life together with his wife's insurance money. But Charles and Margaret made one fatal mistake. They assumed a 73-year-old grandmother would be too trusting to catch on. While they plot her demise over garden fence conversations, Eleanor has been gathering evidence, building her case, and preparing a counterstrike that will destroy their world. They're about to learn the hard way. They picked the wrong woman to underestimate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor and Charles first met in the spring of 1973 at a local diner where she worked as a waitress. He would come in every morning, order the same black coffee and blueberry muffin, and leave her generous tips with small notes of poetry written on the napkins. Back then, his silver-tongued charm felt like something out of a romance novel. Now, 50 years later, Eleanor wondered if that same charm had always masked something darker. Their life at Oak Ridge Haven Retirement Community had been peaceful for the past 5 years. Their modest but comfortable two-bedroom home sat on a corner lot with a garden Eleanor had lovingly tended since they moved in. Charles spent his mornings doing crossword puzzles on their sun-drenched porch, while Eleanor baked cookies for the community bake sales and attended her twice-weekly bridge club meetings. Margaret Wilson moved in next door 3 years ago, after her husband passed away from what she called a sudden illness. She quickly became a fixture in their lives, always ready with a sympathetic ear or a freshly baked casserole. Eleanor had welcomed the friendship, especially since their own children lived states away. David was busy with his law practice in Chicago, and Sarah had her hands full with 3 children in Boston. They visited during holidays, but the days could get lonely. The first changes were so subtle, Eleanor almost missed them. Charles started attending the community garden club meetings with Margaret, despite having shown no interest in gardening before. He began taking evening walks for his health, always somehow running into Margaret among the winding paths of Oak Ridge Haven. Their friendly waves across the fence turned into long conversations that would abruptly end when Eleanor approached. Then came the dizzy spells. At first, Eleanor blamed age. After all, 73 wasn't young anymore, but they seemed to come most often after her evening tea, the one Charles had suddenly insisted on preparing himself. "You work so hard with your volunteer work at the library, dear," he'd say, his concern sounding genuine. "Let me take care of you for a change." The day Margaret brought over her special herbal tea blend for Eleanor's health should have been the first real warning. Charles's eyes had lit up as Margaret explained the careful preparation instructions that only he was to follow. "It's quite delicate," Margaret had said, her practiced smile never reaching her eyes. "The healing properties need a special touch." Eleanor watched them from her kitchen window now, Charles and Margaret in her prized rose garden, their heads bent close together as they examined the blooms. 50 years of marriage had taught her to read Charles's body language like a well-worn book. The way he leaned slightly toward Margaret, the familiar crinkle around his eyes when he laughed. She'd seen it all before, at that diner in 1973. Only now those same gestures carried the weight of betrayal. The family photos lining their hallway told the story of a perfect marriage. Their wedding day, the birth of their children, family vacations, golden anniversary celebration. But lately, Eleanor had noticed Charles avoiding their grandchildren's video calls, making excuses about poor internet connection or afternoon naps. Perhaps he couldn't bear to look into the innocent faces of the family he was planning to destroy. That evening, as Charles brought her the usual tea with a kiss on her forehead, Eleanor caught a glimpse of something in his expression. Anticipation, poorly disguised as concern. She lifted the cup to her lips, pretending not to notice how intently he watched her drink. Eleanor's first undeniable warning came during bridge club on a Tuesday afternoon. Her usual steady hands trembled as she dealt the cards, and the room swayed like a boat on choppy waters. Mrs. Henderson, her bridge partner of 4 years, grabbed her arm as she stumbled. "Eleanor, dear, you've gone white as a sheet," she said, helping her to a chair. "Should we call Charles?" "No," Eleanor responded too quickly, then forced a smile. "Just need to sit for a moment, probably forgot to eat lunch." But she hadn't forgotten lunch. She'd had her usual chicken salad sandwich, followed by Charles's special tea. The tea that always seemed to precede these episodes. That evening, she emptied the tea down the drain when Charles wasn't looking. The next day, she felt fine. The whispered phone calls started around the same time. Eleanor would walk into Charles's study, and he'd quickly end his conversation or switch to discussing the weather. Once she caught a fragment. "Needs to look natural, Margaret. We can't." Their financial papers began disappearing from the usual filing cabinet. Charles claimed he was organizing, but Eleanor found some of them in his desk drawer one morning while looking for stamps, their life insurance policies, retirement accounts, property deed. All the papers that would matter after someone's death. The changes in Charles became more pronounced. He started checking Eleanor's phone, claiming he was helping her with settings. His concern about her health escalated to hovering, always. Watching her take her regular heart medication. "You're getting forgetful, dear," he'd say, though she'd never missed a dose in 15 years. Margaret's presence grew more invasive. She'd appear at their door with increasing frequency, always with some excuse to pull Charles away. Garden club meetings stretched from 1 hour to 3. Their conversations would stop abruptly when Eleanor approached, like guilty children caught, plotting mischief. One morning, Eleanor discovered her jewelry box had been moved slightly on her dresser. Nothing was missing, but she knew Charles had been examining her valuable pieces, the ones he'd given her over 50 years of marriage. Taking inventory, perhaps. The community newsletter became another source of unease. Margaret had written an article about senior safety at home, focusing extensively on accidents, falls, and the importance of life insurance. She'd interviewed another widow, Mrs. Carlton, whose husband had tragically passed the previous year. Eleanor remembered how often Margaret had visited the Carltons before Mr. Carlton's death. During their Sunday drive, Eleanor noticed Charles taking a strange route. They passed 3 funeral homes before he claimed they were just exploring the area. That same evening, she overheard him in his study. "Yes, I understand." "No, she doesn't suspect. The policy is ironclad." Her garden, once a source of joy, became a stage for their performance. Charles and Margaret would spend hours there, pretending to discuss roses while their heads bent close together. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Margaret touched Charles's arm, laughing at something he'd said. It was the same laugh she'd used at Mr. Carlton's funeral. The final confirmation came during movie night. Charles had insisted on an old thriller where a husband poisoned his wife through her evening tea. Eleanor watched him instead of the screen, catching the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth during the murder scene. Margaret, who had invited herself over, sat on their couch like she already owned it, her eyes gleaming in the TV's glow. That night, Eleanor lay awake, listening to Charles's steady breathing beside her. 50 years of marriage had taught her every rhythm of his sleep. This wasn't it. He was awake too, probably thinking about the future he planned with Margaret, a future that required Eleanor's permanent absence. In the darkness, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar emotion rising in her chest. Not fear, not even anger, something colder, more calculated, something that would make Charles and Margaret regret ever underestimating a 73-year-old grandmother. The truth revealed itself on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Charles forgot to close his study door completely. Eleanor had just returned early from her library volunteer shift, cancelled due to a power outage, and heard Margaret's voice, drifting from the crack. The dosage isn't working fast enough, Charles. We need to increase it. Eleanor froze in the hallway, her wet umbrella dripping silently onto the carpet. Patience, dear. Charles's voice carried that soft tone he'd once used with Eleanor. Too much too fast would raise suspicions. The doctor already thinks her dizzy spells are concerning. We don't have time for patience. The insurance policy has a contestability period. 1 year, Charles. We need to act before they can investigate. Eleanor's hand found the wall, steadying herself. The umbrella slipped from her grasp, but she caught it before it could betray her presence. "What about the medication you got from your friend?" Charles asked. "The untraceable one." "Yes, but it's expensive. 20,000 for enough to finish the job." "I can get it from our savings. Eleanor never checks the accounts anyway. She trusts me completely." Their laughter felt like ice water in Eleanor's veins. Moving with a silence born of necessity, Eleanor retreated to the kitchen. Her hands shook as she prepared her usual post-library cup of tea, the same tea Charles had been doctoring. She poured it down the sink, watching the poisoned liquid swirl away. That night she waited until Charles's breathing deepened into genuine sleep before slipping out of bed. His study door opened silently. She'd been oiling the hinges for weeks, preparing for this moment. The evidence lay scattered across his desk, illuminated by moonlight filtering through the window. Insurance papers with death benefit amounts highlighted, printouts of toxicology information, a small notebook recording dates and dosages in Charles's precise handwriting, and there, in the bottom drawer behind old tax returns, a box of Margaret's special tea blend. Eleanor photographed everything with trembling hands, her phone's camera clicking softly in the darkness. In his sock drawer she found more: a pamphlet for an all-cash real estate company, brochures for couples' cruises, and printed emails between Charles and Margaret discussing their future together. One email made her blood run cold. "My Harold never suspected a thing either. The police ruled it natural causes, just like they will with E. The silly old fool actually thanked me for taking care of him at the end." So that's what happened to Margaret's husband. The next morning, Eleanor watched Charles prepare her tea. With new eyes, every loving gesture now revealed its sinister undertone, the careful measuring of the tea leaves, the insistence that the water be exactly the right temperature, the way he watched her take that first sip. "Is everything all right, dear?" he asked, noticing her hesitation. "You seem distracted." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the evidence hidden in her phone. "Just thinking about how lucky I am to have such a caring husband." Charles beamed, clearly mistaking her words for naivety. As he turned away, Eleanor caught sight of their reflection in the kitchen window, a seemingly devoted husband serving his trusting wife her morning tea. The perfect picture of elderly domestic bliss. That same afternoon, she made an excuse to visit the local pharmacy. Her longtime pharmacist, Mr. Rodriguez, furrowed his brow as he examined her heart medication. "Mrs. Thompson, these pills don't look quite right." He held one up to the light. "The color is off, and the imprint. This isn't what I dispensed last month." Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. "Could you document that, Mr. Rodriguez, and perhaps test what's actually in them?" His eyes met hers with understanding. "I'll need to send them to a lab. It will take a few days. Should I be concerned about your safety, Mrs. Thompson?" "Not yet," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "But I may need your help soon." Walking home, Eleanor caught sight of Charles and Margaret in her garden again. They sprang apart as she approached, but not before she saw them holding hands among her prized roses. "Just showing Margaret my new pruning technique," Charles explained smoothly. Eleanor nodded, playing her role of the unsuspecting wife. But inside, something had hardened. They thought they were orchestrating her final act, but they didn't realize the show was about to change dramatically. And this time, Eleanor would be the one writing the script. Eleanor's first stop was the public library's computer lab, where she created a new email account under a false name. She couldn't risk Charles finding anything on their shared home computer. Years of organizing the library's digital archives had taught her more about technology than her husband suspected. Her evidence collection began methodically. She purchased a small notebook from the dollar store, recording every suspicious interaction with times and dates. The dizzy spells after tea documented. Charles's private phone calls logged. Margaret's visits chronicled with precise timestamps. But Eleanor knew memories and notes wouldn't be enough. She needed irrefutable proof. The tiny cameras came from an online store specializing in home security, delivered to her friend Grace's house rather than her own. "My daughter's having trouble with her caregivers," Eleanor explained when Grace questioned the package. The lie tasted bitter but necessary. She installed the first camera in a potted plant overlooking Charles's study desk during his weekly golf game. The second went into a decorative clock in the kitchen, positioned perfectly to capture tea preparation. The third, disguised as a coat hook, watched the garden where Charles and Margaret held their conspiratorial meetings. Eleanor created a careful system for collecting samples. Each time Charles prepared her special tea, she would wait for him to leave, then pour a portion into small vials she'd borrowed from her church's craft supplies. Each sample was dated, labeled, and hidden in an old knitting bag, something Charles would never touch. The tampered heart medication presented another challenge. Eleanor carefully replaced one pill in each day's dose with a vitamin of similar size and color, storing the suspicious pills in a hollow book she'd created during last month's library craft session. The cameras caught Charles regularly checking her pill organizer, completely unaware of her switcheroo. Her phone became a vital tool. She recorded conversations, keeping her device in her cardigan pocket with the microphone exposed. The sound of Margaret discussing increasing the dosage and Charles's cold response about patience made her hands shake, but she forced herself to keep recording. The hardest part was maintaining her routine. She attended bridge club, volunteered at the library, and smiled at community events while building her case. When Charles kissed her goodnight, she kissed back. When Margaret brought over her poisoned casseroles, Eleanor thanked her warmly. Each act of normalcy felt like a performance, but Eleanor had discovered she was a better actress than anyone suspected. She tracked their financial movements too. The joint account showed regular withdrawals, always just under the amount that would trigger a notification. Eleanor photographed bank statements, tracked account numbers, and documented every suspicious transaction. Charles thought she was too trusting to check their finances. He'd forgotten she'd been a bookkeeper before retirement. One afternoon, while Charles was at his garden club meeting, which Eleanor's cameras had revealed to be secret rendezvous, with Margaret, she discovered a burner phone hidden in his golf bag. She photographed every message, every call log, every piece of evidence of their plotting. The texts between them made her stomach turn. "Soon, my love," and "just a little longer," peppered between discussions of poison dosages and asset liquidation. Eleanor created multiple copies of everything. One set of evidence went into a safety deposit box at a bank across town. Another was encrypted and stored in a cloud account Charles didn't know existed. A third was entrusted to her friend Grace, sealed in an envelope with instructions to deliver it to the police if anything unexpected happened to Eleanor. The cameras captured it all. Charles measuring poison into her tea, Margaret delivering mysterious packages, their intimate moments in the garden when they thought no one was watching. Every kiss, every whispered conversation, every calculated move toward her murder, all preserved in high definition. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her facade of gentle naivety. She'd spent 50 years being the perfect wife. Now that same dedication would be their undoing. Let them think she was a foolish old woman. Let them believe their plan was working. Eleanor Thompson was building an arsenal, and when the time came to use it, their assumptions about her would be their greatest weakness. Eleanor perfected her role like a veteran actress. Each morning, she'd greet Charles with the same loving smile she'd worn for 50 years, accepting his poisoned tea with grateful thanks. "You take such good care of me, dear," she'd say, watching. His eyes glint with poorly concealed satisfaction. The community's annual garden party became their stage. Eleanor wore her favorite floral dress and played the part of the doting wife, pretending not to notice how Charles's hand lingered on Margaret's arm during the flower arrangement judging. She laughed at their obvious inside jokes, acted oblivious to their meaningful glances, and maintained her reputation as the sweet, slightly forgetful grandmother everyone loved. "Eleanor, you're looking a bit pale," Margaret would say with manufactured concern, always in front of others. "Perhaps you should sit down. Charles, darling, why don't you get your wife some of that special tea?" The performance extended to their daily routines. Eleanor would accidentally doze off during evening television, giving Charles and Margaret time for their whispered planning sessions in the garden. Her hidden cameras caught every word, every touch, every detail of their scheme. While she snored softly on the couch, their confidence grew with each passing week. Charles stopped hiding his phone calls quite so carefully. Margaret began leaving her car in their driveway rather than around the corner. They grew bolder with their meetings, barely bothering to make excuses anymore. "Bridge club is getting so difficult to follow lately," Eleanor would mumble, providing them with perfect opportunities to exchange knowing looks. She'd fumble with her cards, drop her teacup, act increasingly confused, all while maintaining meticulous notes of their every reaction. At the neighborhood barbecue, Eleanor played her masterpiece. She stumbled slightly, spilling her drink. "Oh dear, I'm so clumsy these days," she apologized, as Charles and Margaret rushed to help. Their concern looked perfect to the observers, but Eleanor's hidden recorder caught their whispered exchange. "It's working faster now, the new dosage." She began leaving her pill organizer in obvious disarray, letting them think their plan was succeeding. Charles would rearrange it with exaggerated patience, explaining which pills to take when, never suspecting that she was switching them out as soon as his back turned. The monthly community meeting provided another opportunity. For their twisted theater, Eleanor volunteered to take minutes, something she'd done for years. But now she let her handwriting grow shaky, her notes become confused. Margaret quickly offered to take over the responsibility, her voice dripping with sympathy. "We all slow down eventually, dear," she said, squeezing Eleanor's shoulder while shooting Charles a meaningful look. In their bedroom each night, Eleanor maintained her most challenging performance. She'd kiss Charles goodnight, trying not to recoil at the touch of lips that had kissed Margaret hours earlier. She'd pretend not to notice when he checked her breathing during what he thought was her sleep, his fingers sometimes lingering near her throat, as if imagining the moment it would stop pulsing. "I'm so lucky," she'd tell the neighbors, her voice wavering perfectly. "Charles is so attentive since my memory started slipping. And Margaret, such a dear friend to help us both." The cameras hidden in her garden caught them later, laughing about her performance, confident in their own superior cunning. They never suspected that every confused smile, every fumbled teacup, every apparent memory lapse was carefully choreographed. Eleanor had spent 50 years learning to be the perfect wife. Now she was using those same skills to become the perfect victim, right up until the moment she would turn the tables and become something else entirely. Eleanor's investigation into Margaret's past began with a simple obituary search at the library's computer. Harold Wilson wasn't Margaret's first husband. He was her third. Both previous husbands had died under similarly suspicious circumstances. One from accidental food poisoning, another from a medication mix-up. Each death had left Margaret significantly wealthier. The pattern emerged like a dark tapestry being unwoven. Every 3 to 5 years, Margaret would move to a new community, always targeting older men with substantial insurance policies. Harold had been her longest con. 7 years of marriage before his sudden illness. The police had investigated each death, but Margaret's careful planning and convincing widow's grief had deflected suspicion. Eleanor discovered financial records showing Charles had secretly refinanced their house 3 months ago. The money trail led to offshore accounts, carefully hidden beneath layers of transactions. Their retirement savings had been slowly draining away, converted to untraceable assets. They weren't just planning her death, they were preparing to disappear afterward. A deep dive into Charles's emails revealed another shocking truth. Their relationship hadn't begun recently as Eleanor had assumed. They'd been in contact for over a year, long before Margaret, coincidentally, moved next door. Charles had found her through an online forum drawn to posts she'd made about starting fresh and removing obstacles to happiness. They'd planned everything, down to Margaret's careful integration into their community life. The lab results from Eleanor's medication samples finally came back, confirming her worst fears. The poison wasn't just in her tea. They'd been tagging her from multiple angles. Her heart medication had been replaced with lookalikes containing small doses of untraceable toxins. The cookies Margaret regularly brought over contained similar compounds. Even her favorite hand cream had been tampered with, designed to slowly absorb through her skin. More disturbing were the conversations Eleanor's cameras captured when she was supposedly napping. Charles and Margaret discussing funeral arrangements, planning their new life together, laughing about how easily Eleanor was falling for their act. They'd already picked out a house in Costa Rica, chosen new names, established false identities. Margaret had done this before. She knew exactly how to vanish after a successful kill. Eleanor's research uncovered connections to other suspicious deaths in retirement communities across 3 states. Always the same pattern. Margaret would appear, befriend a couple, and within a year one spouse would die mysteriously. Sometimes she targeted the husbands, sometimes the wives, always depending on who had control of the assets. The most chilling discovery came from Margaret's personal diary, which Eleanor managed to photograph during one of Margaret's garden club meetings. The entries revealed a calculated predator who viewed murder as simply business. She kept meticulous notes on each victim's habits, documented their declining health with clinical detachment, and planned her escapes with military precision. One entry made Eleanor's blood run cold. Charles is different from the others. Usually, I work alone, but he has a natural talent for this. The way he tenderly serves his wife poison each morning, never letting his mask slip. He's a born performer. We'll make an excellent team for future projects. They weren't planning to stop with Eleanor. She was just going to be their first joint venture, a trial run for a larger scheme. They had already identified potential targets in Costa Rica, planning to prey on wealthy, expatriate communities where background checks were less rigorous. That night, watching Charles prepare her evening tea with loving care, Eleanor realized the true scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. How many other unsuspecting victims would fall prey to this deadly duo if she didn't stop them? The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders as she accepted the poisoned tea with a grateful smile, already planning her next move. Eleanor knew that choosing the wrong confidant could be fatal. She needed allies who would believe the unbelievable, that a respected retired accountant and a seemingly grieving widow were actually calculating murderers. More importantly, she needed people who could keep their knowledge hidden until the perfect moment. Her first ally was Detective Sarah Martinez, recently retired from the police force's homicide division. They'd met at the library's mystery book club, where Eleanor had carefully steered their discussions toward real-life cases involving poisonings. Martinez's sharp eyes had narrowed with interest when Eleanor described certain fictional scenarios that paralleled Margaret's methods. Hypothetically, Eleanor had asked during one of their private discussions, how would someone prove they were being poisoned if they couldn't stop taking the poison without alerting the poisoner? Martinez didn't miss a beat. Hypothetically, they'd need multiple samples, documented chain of custody, and a damn good reason for not going to the police immediately. Her gaze bore into Eleanor. Want to tell me what's really going on? Eleanor's second recruit was her pharmacist, Mr. Rodriguez. He'd already proven his discretion with the tainted medication, and his professional reputation would add credibility to her evidence. He began documenting everything: the tampered pills, the chemical analysis results, the pattern of Charles's suspicious prescription requests. "I have a friend at the FDA's forensic lab," Rodriguez told her quietly one day. "She can test samples without filing official reports, just in case your situation requires discretion." Grace, her bridge club friend, became her emergency backup. Eleanor gave her a sealed envelope containing copies of all her evidence and clear instructions. If anything happened to Eleanor, everything would go straight to Detective Martinez. Grace didn't know the envelope's contents, but she understood the gravity of her role. "I'm not asking questions," Grace said firmly. "But I'm watching that husband of yours, and his garden club friend too." The most delicate addition to her network was her lawyer, James Chen. He'd helped write her will years ago, and now she visited him under the guise of making updates. Instead, she was building a legal fortress. "Your documentation is meticulous," Chen noted, reviewing her evidence. "But why not report them now?" "Because I need more than justice," Eleanor replied. "I need to make sure they can never do this to anyone else." Her most unexpected ally emerged in Margaret's previous neighborhood. Eleanor had tracked down Patricia Winters, the best friend of Margaret's last husband. Initially hesitant, Patricia became a wealth of information once Eleanor gained her trust. "I knew something was wrong with Harold's death," Patricia confided during a careful phone conversation. "The symptoms, the timing, Margaret's convenient explanations, but I could never prove anything." Eleanor built redundancies into her support system. Each ally held different pieces of information, different aspects of her evidence. If Charles or Margaret discovered one connection, the others would remain secure. She arranged check-in protocols. Missed calls or appointments would trigger specific responses. Detective Martinez helped her establish a safe house, a small apartment paid for in cash. "You'll need somewhere to go when it's time to spring the trap," she explained, showing Eleanor the hidden security features she'd installed. Mr. Rodriguez ensured Eleanor had clean medications hidden away. Grace kept extra clothes and emergency supplies at her house. James Chen prepared legal documents that would spring into action the moment Eleanor gave the word. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her performance as the declining wife. She let Charles see her making small mistakes in managing her contacts, calling Grace by the wrong name, mixing up appointment times. Every apparent slip reinforced his belief in her failing faculties while masking her growing network of supporters. She learned to speak in code, to leave messages that appeared innocent to Charles, but carried vital information to her allies. A comment about the weather could signal distress. A question about Bridge Club might indicate a need for immediate help. Each ally was chosen not just for their skills or positions, but for their discretion and determination. They shared Eleanor's growing conviction that stopping Charles and Margaret wasn't just about one woman's survival, it was about preventing future victims. Late at night, reviewing her network of supporters, Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction. Charles and Margaret thought they were the only ones who could plan meticulously, who could maintain a convincing facade. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first close call came during an unexpected rainstorm. Charles had forgotten his umbrella at his garden club meeting, and Eleanor, playing the devoted wife, decided to bring it to him. She found the community center dark and empty. No garden club in sight. Following a hunch, she drove past Margaret's house, where Charles's car sat in the driveway. Just as she was photographing the vehicle for evidence, Margaret's front door opened. Eleanor barely had time to duck down in her car, her heart pounding as Charles and Margaret stepped onto the porch. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched them embrace, heard fragments of their conversation about just a few more weeks. When Charles came home later, Eleanor had dinner waiting. "How was garden club, dear?" she asked innocently. "Cancelled," he replied smoothly. "The storm, you know." I stayed at the center catching up on paperwork. The lie rolled off his tongue so easily that Eleanor almost admired his performance. That night, she added the photos and his lie to her growing evidence file. The second near discovery happened in Charles's study. Eleanor was photographing new documents she'd found hidden in his desk when she heard the garage door opener. She'd miscalculated his golf game timing. Charles was home early. Her hands shook as she rushed to return everything to its exact position. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs nearly paralyzed her with fear. At the last second, she grabbed her reading glasses from his desk, her planned excuse for being in his study, and opened the door just as he reached the top step. "Oh," she exclaimed, letting her voice waver. "You startled me, dear." "I couldn't find my glasses anywhere else." Charles's suspicious look faded into condescending affection. "They're on your head, sweetheart," he said, reaching out to touch them where they'd been all along. Eleanor managed a confused laugh. "Oh dear, I'm getting so forgetful." She shuffled past him, feeling his eyes on her back, wondering if she'd replaced everything exactly as she'd found it. The third incident was the most dangerous. Eleanor had set up a meeting with Detective Martinez at a cafe in the next town, not knowing that Margaret had a dental appointment in the same area. As Eleanor and Martinez discussed evidence over coffee, Margaret walked in. Eleanor saw her first, thankfully. Without missing a beat, she loudly began discussing her fictional grandchildren with Martinez, who caught on immediately and played along. Margaret paused, watching them, then apparently decided their meeting was coincidental and left. But that evening at dinner, Charles mentioned casually, "Margaret said she saw you in Millbrook today, making quite a drive for coffee." Eleanor had her story ready. "Oh yes, I was meeting Sarah. She's new to my bridge club. Poor dear got lost trying to find our usual cafe. Didn't Margaret look nice?" I waved, but she must not have seen me. The closest call came when Eleanor was retrieving a sample of the poisoned tea for testing. She'd just finished pouring it into a sample vial when Charles walked into the kitchen. In her surprise, she knocked over the teacup. Quick thinking saved her. She deliberately dropped her pill organizer too, scattering capsules across the floor. Charles rushed to help her clean up, never noticing the vial she'd slipped into her pocket. "I'm so clumsy lately," she apologized, watching him gather her. "And pills." She noted how carefully he checked that all the tampered capsules were recovered. "Don't worry, dear," he soothed, helping her up. "Everyone gets a bit shaky at our age." Eleanor's hands were indeed shaking, but not from age. The sample vial felt like it was burning in her pocket, a tiny vessel of evidence that could destroy their murderous plans. Later that night, she heard Charles on the phone with Margaret. "She's getting worse. Dropped everything today. No, I don't think she suspects." "Yes, soon." Eleanor lay in bed, listening to his whispered conversation, her heart still racing from the close call. Each near discovery reinforced the dangerous game she was playing. One slip, one miscalculation could be fatal. But each successful deception, each piece of evidence safely gathered, brought her closer to springing her trap. The discovery that changed everything came through an unexpected source. Eleanor was organizing the community's annual bake sale when Mrs. Henderson pulled her aside, concern etched on her face. "Eleanor, dear, I hate to worry you, but I overheard something at the pharmacy yesterday. Charles was asking Mr. Rodriguez about medication interactions with digitalis. Isn't that what they used to extract from foxglove plants? My late husband was a botanist and, well," she hesitated, "I couldn't help but notice Margaret's been planting an awful lot of foxglove in her garden lately." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She'd noticed the new purple flowers, but hadn't made the connection. That evening, she watched through her kitchen window as Charles and Margaret worked in her garden, their gloved hands carefully tending to the deadly blooms. The next morning, Detective Martinez confirmed her fears. Digitalis poisoning mimics heart failure in elderly victims, she explained during their secret meeting. It's nearly impossible to detect unless someone's specifically looking for it. And with your existing heart condition, the perfect cover. Eleanor finished. Her hands trembled as she sipped her untainted coffee. There's more, Martinez said, sliding a file across the table. We found similar plantings at Margaret's previous residences. Always foxglove. Always just before her husband's. And deaths. Eleanor returned home to find Charles unusually attentive. I made you a special lunch, dear, he announced, presenting a sandwich and her favorite tea. Through her hidden camera, she later watched him carefully crush dried foxglove leaves into the teapot, Margaret supervising his technique. That night, Eleanor accessed Charles's email through the back door she'd created weeks ago. Their plan was accelerating. Plane tickets to Costa Rica booked for 3 weeks' time, a foreign bank account ready to receive their funds. Most alarmingly, a message from Margaret. The new addition to her tea should work faster. Be ready, Eleanor's. Next discovery nearly stopped her heart. Hidden in Charles's study, she found draft obituaries, 3 versions, each detailing her tragic death from heart failure. The dates were blank, waiting to be filled in. But the final catalyst came from Mr. Rodriguez. He'd had the latest tea sample analyzed. The concentration of digitalis was lethal. 1 cup of this, he warned, and even your regular heart medication couldn't save you. They're done testing. They're ready to end this. Eleanor gathered her allies for an emergency meeting at her safe house. Detective Martinez spread out the evidence, toxicology reports, financial records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, everything needed for a conviction. We could arrest them now, Martinez offered, but Eleanor shook her head. Not yet. And the rest isn't enough. They've escaped charges before. We need something irrefutable, something that ensures they can never do this again. James Chen, her lawyer, reviewed the files. What you're suggesting is dangerous, Eleanor. 1 wrong move. They're planning to kill me within days. Eleanor interrupted. Doing nothing is more dangerous. Grace squeezed her hand. What do you need from us? Eleanor pulled out a detailed timeline she'd created. 3 days. I need everything in place in 3 days. Charles just ordered more digitalis extract from Margaret's contact. Once it arrives, they'll make their final move. We need to be ready. She outlined her plan, watching her allies' expressions shift from concern to grim determination. Each had a crucial role to play in what would become their final act. That evening, Eleanor returned home to find Charles and Margaret sharing tea in the garden. They invited her to join them, their smiles never reaching their eyes. As she accepted a cup, with trembling hands, playing her role of the unsuspecting wife one last time, she thought about the mechanisms already in motion. 3 days. In 3 days, she would either expose their murderous scheme to the world or become their final victim. As she sipped her tea, carefully avoiding the poison she knew it contained, Eleanor silently thanked Mrs. Henderson for her timely warning. Sometimes the smallest details could change everything. Charles watched her drink with poorly concealed anticipation. Eleanor set down her cup and smiled sweetly at them both, knowing that their confidence in her ignorance would be their downfall. The game was entering its final phase, and only she knew all the pieces in play. The final preparations began with a phone call to her children. Eleanor kept her voice steady as she told them she was planning a surprise anniversary celebration. "Come early," she insisted. "And please, don't tell your father." The tremor in her voice was real. This might be the last time she spoke to them if anything went wrong. Detective Martinez set up surveillance equipment in every room of Eleanor's safe house. "The moment they incriminate themselves," she explained, checking the video feeds. "My team moves in, but you need to get them to confess, both of them, together." Mr. Rodriguez provided her with identical pills to replace the poisoned ones, placebos that looked exactly like her heart medication. "I've documented every substitution they made," he confirmed, handing her a detailed report. "The evidence is undeniable. James Chen finalized the legal preparations. "I filed sealed documents with 3 different courts," he told Eleanor. "The moment we move, their assets freeze. No escape to Costa Rica, no access to the money they stole from you." Grace helped Eleanor rehearse her part one final time. "Remember," she coached, "you're not just playing a victim anymore, you're leading them into a trap. Your confusion needs to turn to clarity at exactly the right moment." Eleanor's hidden cameras captured Charles and Margaret in the garden that afternoon, tending to their foxglove plants. Their conversation drifted through the open window. The extract arrived, stronger than before. By tomorrow evening, later, Eleanor watched Charles prepare her evening tea with methodical precision. He'd grown so confident in his routine that he didn't even try to hide the small vial of foxglove extract he added to her cup. Behind her facade of gentle confusion, Eleanor catalogued every movement, every measurement, every damning detail. That night, she made her final recordings. "If anything happens to me," she spoke softly into her phone, "this is why, this is how, and this is who." She uploaded the file to multiple secure locations, each set to automatically send to law enforcement if she didn't enter a code every 24 hours. Detective Martinez's team established positions around the neighborhood. "We'll be watching," she assured Eleanor. "Every angle covered, but you'll have to let them think they're succeeding before we can move." In her safe house, Eleanor reviewed her evidence one last time. Financial records showing the money trail, photos of Charles and Margaret's secret meetings, recordings of their conversations about poison and plans, documentation of Margaret's past victims, toxicology reports, tampered medication samples, witness statements, surveillance footage. A complete chronicle of their calculated malice. She laid out her clothes for the next day, her favorite blue dress, the one Charles always complimented. "You should wear that more often," he'd say, not knowing she'd chosen it specifically. For its contrast against video footage, its ability to highlight any physical distress she might need to display. The final touch was a hidden camera disguised as a brooch, a gift from Detective Martinez. "It's linked directly to our surveillance van," she explained. "Whatever happens, we'll see it, we'll know." Eleanor sat at her vanity, studying her reflection. Tomorrow she would need to play the role of her life, not just the confused wife anymore, but a woman discovering an unbearable betrayal. Her performance had to be perfect, had to lead Charles and Margaret exactly where she needed them. She thought of their victims, Margaret's previous husbands, possibly others they'd never discovered. She thought of their plans for Costa Rica, of the future victims they would claim if she failed. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. A text from Charles lit up her phone. "Don't forget your medicine tomorrow, dear. I'll make you my special tea for breakfast." Eleanor smiled at his message, knowing it might be one of the last acts of his freedom. Tomorrow, she would trade her mask of confusion for one of devastation, then fury, then triumph. Tomorrow, she would ensure that Charles and Margaret's final victim would be their own freedom. She slipped into bed beside her husband of 50 years, listening to him breathe, remembering decades of love turned to betrayal. In less than 12 hours, everything would change. Eleanor closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to review every step of her plan one final time. She couldn't afford a single mistake. Too many lives, past and future, depended on her performance. The morning dawned bright and clear, nature's mockery of the dark scene about to unfold. Eleanor dressed carefully in her chosen blue dress, pinning the camera brooch precisely. Her hands were steady as she prepared for her final performance. Charles was already in the kitchen, the poisoned tea steeping. Margaret had dropped by early, watching with poorly concealed anticipation as Eleanor entered. "Good morning, dear," Charles smiled, holding out the teacup. "I've made your favorite." Eleanor accepted it with a trembling hand, not acting this time, but from the weight of what was coming. She took a careful sip, then staggered slightly. Charles and Margaret exchanged quick glances. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, false concern dripping from her voice. Perhaps you should sit down. Eleanor stumbled to the kitchen chair, her breath becoming labored. This part wasn't acting either. The fear of what she had to do next made her heart race. Naturally, I don't feel right, she whispered. Charles knelt beside her, checking her pulse. His touch, once loving, now felt like poison itself. Your heart's racing, dear. Did you take your medication? The pills you gave me? Eleanor's voice cracked. The ones you've been tampering with? The silence that fell was absolute. Charles's hand froze on her wrist. What did you say? His voice was dangerously soft. Eleanor pulled her arm away, rising unsteadily. The digitalis, Charles, from Margaret's foxglove. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? Margaret's face went white. Charles stepped back, his mask slipping for the first time. You're confused, dear, he tried, but Eleanor cut him off. Confused? Like Harold was confused before he died, Margaret? Like your other husbands? How many were there, really? Eleanor? Charles's voice held a warning, but she pressed on. I know everything. The Costa Rica plans, the offshore accounts, the life insurance policy. She pulled out her phone, playing a recording of their garden conversation. Their own voices filled the kitchen, discussing poison dosages and death timelines. Margaret moved toward the door, but Eleanor's next words froze her. The police are outside. They've been watching you both for weeks. Every entrance is covered. You're bluffing, Charles snarled, his gentle husband facade vanishing completely. Eleanor smiled for the first time that morning. Check the cameras in the garden, the ones in your study. The recordings of every conversation you had while I was napping. Check my medication samples at the lab. Check the bank records I've uncovered. She watched realization dawn in their eyes. Not just that they'd been caught, but that they'd been outplayed by the very woman they'd underestimated. How long? Charles demanded. Long enough. Every cup of tea, every tampered pill, every secret meeting. I documented it all. Did you really think I was as helpless as you wanted me to be? Margaret broke first, her composure cracking. Charles, we need to what? Eleanor interrupted. Run! Your accounts are frozen. Your passport's flagged. The Costa Rica house seized. It's over. Charles lunged for her, his face contorted with rage. But Eleanor was ready. She pressed a button on her phone. Within seconds, Detective Martinez and her team burst through both doors. Charles Thompson, Margaret Wilson, you're under arrest, Martinez announced as officers secured the struggling pair. Eleanor watched them being handcuffed, these people who had planned her death over tea and garden flowers. Charles turned to her one last time, disbelief still etched on his face. 50 years, he spat. You threw away 50 years. Eleanor straightened her blue dress, touching the brooch that had recorded everything. No, Charles, you threw it away. I just made sure. You'd pay for it. As they were led away, Eleanor sank into her kitchen chair, genuinely exhausted now. Through the window she could see their neighbors gathering, drawn by the police presence. Soon, everyone would know. The mask she'd worn for so long could finally fall away. Detective Martinez squeezed her shoulder. You did it. Yes, Eleanor replied, looking at the half-empty teacup still sitting on her counter. The last poison they would ever try to give her. I did. The police station's interview room felt smaller than Eleanor had imagined. She sat on one side of the table, her blue dress still immaculate, watching Charles through the one-way glass. Gone was the loving husband of 50 years. In his place sat a stranger, cold eyes fixed on his reflection, probably wondering if she was behind it. Are you sure you want to do this? Detective Martinez asked. We have enough evidence without a direct confrontation. I need to hear it from him, Eleanor replied. All of it. She entered the interview room with measured steps, her camera brooch still recording. Charles's head snapped up, his lips curling into a sneer. Come to gloat, dear wife. Eleanor sat down carefully, placing a folder between them. No, Charles, I came to understand why. 50 years of marriage, and you chose to end it like this. 50 years of playing nursemaid to your bridge clubs and charity work, he spat. While Margaret showed me what real living could be. She understands me, like she understood Harold and the others. Colour drained from Charles's face. What others? Eleanor spread photographs across the table. Margaret's previous husbands, death certificates, insurance payouts. She's been doing this for years, Charles. You weren't special. You were just another Mark. But this time she got greedy. She wanted a partner. You're lying, but his voice wavered. Am I? Did she tell you about Thomas, her first husband, or James, her second? Both died from accidental poisonings. Both had massive insurance policies. Both trusted her completely, just like you trusted her. In the next room, Margaret was breaking. Eleanor watched through the glass as she crumbled under Detective Martinez's questioning. Years of carefully crafted lies unraveling in hours. What did she promise you, Charles? A new life in Costa Rica. She promised that to Harold too, right before she killed him. You don't understand, Charles's voice cracked. We had plans. The money from your insurance would have gone straight into her private account, Eleanor interrupted, sliding forward bank documents. The one you didn't know about, in the Cayman Islands. She's been transferring funds there for months. Not to your shared account. You were just another victim, Charles. And when the money was secure, you would have had a tragic accident too. She watched the realization dawn in his eyes, saw the moment his perfect fantasy shattered. No, he whispered. Margaret loves me. We planned everything together. Eleanor placed one final document before him. Margaret's diary, found in her house during the arrest. Read it. See how she really saw you, a useful tool, an amateur she could mold, a stepping stone to bigger cons. Charles's hands shook as he read Margaret's clinical assessment of him. Charles is easier to manipulate than Harold was. His desperation to escape his marriage makes him sloppy, dangerous, but useful for now. His face crumpled, decades of authority and control dissolving into confusion and betrayal. All this time, yes, Eleanor said softly, while you were plotting my death, she was plotting yours. The only difference is, I figured it out first. The door opened, and Detective Martinez entered. Mrs. Thompson, we have Margaret's full confession. She's admitted to everything, including the plans for after your death. Charles's head snapped up. What plans? The accident she arranged for you, Eleanor explained. The brake lines on your car were already tampered with. Once the insurance money cleared, your tragic death would have completed her escape. She would have vanished with everything, leaving your body in a ravine somewhere. Charles slumped in, his chair, the last of his defiance, draining away. I helped her plan your murder, he whispered. Yes, you did. The devoted husband, serving his wife poisoned tea every morning. Tell me, Charles, how long would you have kept up the act? How many more gentle kisses and loving words before you watch me die? His silence was answer enough. Eleanor stood, smoothing her blue dress. Goodbye, Charles. I'd say I'm sorry it ended this way, but that would be a lie, and I think we've both had enough of those. She walked out without looking back, leaving her husband of 50 years to face the consequences of his choices. In the hallway, she heard Margaret's sobs from the other interview room, the sound of another carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. The county courthouse buzzed with tension during the preliminary hearing. Eleanor sat in the front row, back straight, her children flanking her protectively. David had flown in from Chicago the moment he heard, and Sarah had left her 3 kids, with her husband in Boston, to support her mother. Charles and Margaret were led in separately, both looking considerably older than they had just weeks ago. Prison jumpsuits had replaced their carefully coordinated garden outfits. Margaret's perfectly maintained hair had lost its dye, showing steely grey roots. Charles couldn't meet Eleanor's eyes. The evidence presentation began methodically. Mr. Rodriguez testified about the tampered medications, presenting chemical analysis of the digitalis levels found in Eleanor's tea samples. His documentation was meticulous, showing the gradual increase in poison concentrations over months. "In my professional opinion," he stated firmly, "the final dosage would have been fatal within hours." Detective Martinez presented the surveillance footage next. The courtroom watched in silence as Charles carefully added poison to Eleanor's tea, as Margaret provided instructions on proper dosage, as they plotted their escape over Eleanor's anticipated death. Their own voices echoed through the chamber, discussing timeline and logistics with chilling casualness. The financial evidence proved devastating. James Chen methodically outlined the money trail: Eleanor's stolen retirement funds, the offshore accounts, the Costa Rica property purchased in Margaret's alias. But the most damaging revelation came from Margaret's previous financial records. "The defendant has a pattern," the prosecutor explained, displaying a timeline. Each of her previous husband's deaths was followed by substantial insurance payouts. Each time, she moved to a new community, changed her appearance slightly, and found her next victim. Margaret's composure finally cracked when they introduced Harold's autopsy results. New forensic testing had confirmed digitalis poisoning, evidence that would lead to her previous case being reopened. Charles's attorney attempted to paint him as another victim, manipulated by a professional con artist, but the recorded conversations showed his eager participation, his careful planning, his calculated deception of his wife of 50 years. During a court recess, Eleanor overheard snippets of conversation from the gathered Oak Ridge Haven residents. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears away, recalling all the times she'd shared tea with them. Grace sat with her bridge club, who now realized how close they'd come to losing one of their own. The most dramatic moment came when Patricia Winters, Harold's old friend, testified about Margaret's previous behavior patterns. "She always chose careful, methodical men," Patricia explained. "Men who could help her refine her technique. Charles wasn't just a victim, he was an upgrade to her method." Margaret's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution stood firm. The evidence was too overwhelming, the crimes too calculated. When Charles realized Margaret had planned to kill him too, he turned on her completely, offering to testify about every detail of their scheme. The community college chemistry professor called as an expert witness explained the sophistication of their poisoning method. The combination of digitalis with her existing heart medication was designed to mask symptoms as natural deterioration. Without Mrs. Thompson's careful documentation and sample collection, it would have appeared as simple heart failure. Eleanor's children testified about the changes they'd noticed in their father over the past year. Sarah described his increasing impatience with family video calls. David recounted finding suspicious bank transfers while helping with their taxes. Throughout the proceedings, Eleanor maintained her dignity. She answered questions clearly and precisely, her documentation providing irrefutable evidence of their plot. Her testimony was devastating in its detail. Every cup of tea, every whispered conversation, every secret meeting catalogued and verified. By day's end, there was little doubt about the outcome. The judge ordered both held without bail, citing flight risk and the overwhelming evidence. Charles, finally seeming to grasp the magnitude of his actions, tried to catch Eleanor's eye as he was led away. She turned her back, focusing instead on her children, her friends, her real support system. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear the prosecution's statement. But Eleanor had already said everything she needed to say. She left through a side door, accompanied by her children and Detective Martinez, ready to begin the next chapter of her life. One where she no longer had to pretend, no longer had to fear the person sharing her home. The story broke nationally 3 days after the preliminary hearing. "Black Widow of the Retirement Community," screamed one headline. 50 years to murder, a husband's betrayal, declared another. Eleanor's quiet life at Oak Ridge Haven became the center of a media storm that exposed far more than just Charles and Margaret's failed plot. The first call came from Arizona. A woman whose husband had died 3 years ago recognized Margaret from her younger days, when she went by Margaret Wilson Brooks. "She was our neighbor," the woman told Detective Martinez. "She made my Henry the same special tea during his illness." Then came a report from Florida, another from Oregon. Each story followed the same pattern. Margaret, under various names, befriending couples, targeting vulnerable spouses, disappearing after suspicious deaths. Charles, it seemed, hadn't just been her latest victim. He'd been her first willing accomplice. The Oak Ridge Haven community reeled from the revelations. The garden club, where Margaret had grown her poisonous flowers, was temporarily suspended. Every member recalled how she'd offered gardening advice, suggesting foxglove for its lovely flowers. The club president ordered a complete removal of all potentially toxic plants. Eleanor's bridge group rallied around her, but their weekly games were now colored by dark revelations. "She sat right here," Mrs. Henderson kept saying, staring at Margaret's empty chair, "planning murder over cucumber sandwiches." The retirement community's management called an emergency meeting to address security concerns. Background checks would be enhanced. New residents would face greater scrutiny. But the trust that had made Oak Ridge Haven special was irreparably damaged. Neighbors viewed each other with new suspicion. Every act of kindness was questioned. Grace organized a support group for residents struggling to process the betrayal. "We're not just dealing with crime," she explained during their first meeting. "We're dealing with the death of our innocence. At our age, that's a difficult thing to lose." Eleanor's children wanted her to move closer to them, away from the memories and media attention, but she refused. "This is my home," she insisted. "They didn't take my life. They won't take my community either." The case sparked investigations into other suspicious deaths in retirement communities across the country. Detective Martinez found herself consulting with other departments, sharing insights from Eleanor's meticulous evidence gathering. "Senior citizens aren't helpless victims," she emphasized in her reports. "Sometimes they're the most formidable opponents because everyone underestimates them." Mr. Rodriguez's pharmacy implemented new security measures for prescription medications. He began offering free medication safety workshops, teaching seniors how to recognize tampering and protect themselves from exploitation. Eleanor's story had exposed vulnerabilities in the system that no one had considered before. Local news crews interviewed Eleanor's neighbors, all trying to understand how they'd missed the signs. The community's guilt manifested in casseroles, left on Eleanor's porch, offers of help with her garden, invitations to dinner. She accepted their support with grace, understanding their need to make amends for their unwitting role in her endangerment. Sarah's oldest daughter, Jenny, started a social media campaign raising awareness about elder abuse and exploitation. The story resonated far beyond their community, sparking discussions about vulnerability, trust, and the masks people wear. But perhaps the most profound impact came from others like Eleanor, elderly spouses who had sensed something wrong but doubted their instincts. Her story empowered them to speak up, to investigate, to trust their suspicions. 3 similar cases in other states were uncovered within months. Potential murders prevented because someone refused to dismiss their concerns as paranoia. Eleanor watched it all unfold from her front porch, the same one where Charles had planned. Her death over morning coffee. She kept her garden, but replaced the roses with different flowers. Every change in her community, every new security measure, every support group meeting represented a small victory. Proof that even the darkest betrayal couldn't destroy the human capacity for resilience and renewal. The first morning Eleanor woke up without having to pretend felt strange. No need to check her tea for poison, no need to maintain her facade of confusion, no need to watch every word and gesture. The silence in her house felt different now. Not threatening, but peaceful. She started small. Rearranged the furniture that Charles had always insisted stay in the same place. Painted the kitchen a bright yellow instead of the subtle beige he'd preferred. turned his study into a reading room, filling it with books she'd always wanted to read, but he'd dismissed as not your type, dear. Support came from unexpected places. Mrs. Carlton, whose husband had died under Margaret's care the previous year, became a frequent visitor. They shared a unique bond, both survivors of Margaret's schemes, though Mrs. Carlton hadn't discovered the truth until too late. Together, they started a widows' support group, but not the kind that dwelled in sadness. Theirs was about rediscovery, about finding joy in independence. Detective Martinez introduced Eleanor to another survivor of domestic deception, a retired judge who'd discovered his wife of 30 years had been slowly poisoning him. He now ran a foundation helping elderly victims of abuse. "We need someone like you on our board," he told Eleanor, "someone who fought back and won." Eleanor's children witnessed a transformation in their mother, the quiet, accommodating woman who had deferred to their father's decisions, bloomed into someone new. She took computer classes at the community college, started a blog about her experience, began speaking at senior centers about recognizing signs of exploitation. "Mum's more alive now than she's been in years," Sarah commented to David during one of their weekly family video calls. They watched their mother enthusiastically describe her new volunteer work with a local crisis hotline, her eyes bright with purpose. The garden underwent the biggest transformation. Eleanor ripped out every plant and started fresh. "A clean slate," she explained to Grace, who helped her plan the new layout. They planted vegetables, herbs, and flowers chosen for their healing properties, a deliberate contrast to the poisonous blooms that had grown there before. Her bridge club noticed the changes too. Eleanor played with a new confidence, no longer apologizing for winning. She hosted games at her house, serving tea without fear, laughing genuinely for the first time in years. The other ladies followed her example, several of them also making changes they'd long hesitated over. Divorcing unhappy marriages, pursuing forgotten dreams, refusing to be defined by their age or others' expectations. One morning, Eleanor found an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a card from a woman in Michigan. "I recognize the signs in my own marriage because of your story. You saved my life." Similar letters began arriving regularly, each one reinforcing Eleanor's decision to share her experience publicly. She kept the letters in a box in her new reading room, along with the diary she'd started after Charles's arrest. Its pages chronicled not just her healing process, but her discoveries about herself. "I thought survival meant enduring," she wrote. "Now I know it means growing." The community college asked her to teach a course on personal safety for seniors. Eleanor expanded it to include financial security, emotional well-being, and the importance of maintaining independence. Her classes became so popular they had to move to a larger venue. On quiet evenings, Eleanor would sit on her porch. Not the lonely vigils of before, but peaceful moments of contemplation. Sometimes Grace would join her, or Mrs. Carlton, or other friends she'd made since her transformation. They'd share stories, plans, dreams they'd previously thought too late to pursue. "I spent 50 years being Charles's wife," she told her support group. "Now I'm finally being Eleanor." The statement earned knowing nods from others who'd found themselves after similar losses. Life wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days, moments when 5 decades of memories ambushed her with grief for what had been lost, or perhaps had never really existed. But Eleanor faced these moments with the same strength that had helped her survive. Charles's betrayal. She was no longer playing a role. She was finally, truly herself. The courthouse steps were crowded on the day of the verdict. Eleanor arrived early, accompanied by her children and Detective Martinez. News cameras tracked her entrance, but she walked past them with quiet dignity, her head held high. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Survivors of Margaret's previous attempts had flown in from across the country. Mrs. Carlton sat in the front row, clutching a photo of her late husband. Representatives from senior advocacy groups filled the back rows, their presence a testament to the case's broader implications. Charles and Margaret were brought in separately. Margaret's carefully maintained appearance had crumbled during her months in custody. Her roots were grey, her face lined without makeup. Charles looked every bit his 75 years now, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his crimes. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating. They presented a timeline of Margaret's victims, 7 confirmed deaths across 3 decades. Charles's willing participation had made her latest attempt her most sophisticated yet. The evidence Eleanor had gathered proved instrumental in connecting all the cases. "This isn't just about attempted murder," the prosecutor stated. "This is about a systematic pattern of predation targeting vulnerable seniors. Mrs. Thompson's courage didn't just save her own life, it exposed decades of crimes that might have otherwise gone unpunished." Margaret's defense tried to paint her as mentally unstable, a victim of her own traumatic past, but the methodical nature of her crimes, the careful financial planning, and the detailed records she'd kept undermined any claims of diminished capacity. Charles's lawyer attempted one final plea for leniency, citing his client's age and previous clean record. "My client was manipulated by a practiced predator," he argued, but the evidence told a different story, showed his eager participation, his careful planning, his willingness to murder his wife of 50 years for money and a new life. When the jury returned after just 4 hours of deliberation, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Eleanor sat perfectly still as the verdicts were read. In the case of the state versus Margaret Wilson on the charges of attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of fraud, and 6 counts of first-degree murder. In the deaths of her previous victims, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Margaret collapsed in her chair, her mask of composure finally shattering completely. In the case of the state versus Charles Thompson, on the charges of attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and financial fraud, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Charles turned to look at Eleanor, but she kept her eyes forward, showing no reaction to the man who had planned to end her life over morning tea. The judge's sentencing was swift and severe. Margaret received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Charles, despite his age, was sentenced to 25 years. Neither would ever know freedom again. As they were led away, Margaret finally broke her silence. "I would have succeeded if it weren't for you," she spat at Eleanor. "You ruined everything." Eleanor stood, meeting her gaze steadily. "No, Margaret, you ruined everything yourself. I just made sure you'd never do it again." Outside the courthouse, Eleanor faced the media briefly. "Justice isn't just about punishment," she stated. "It's about prevention. If my story helps one other person recognize the signs and save themselves, then everything I went through has meaning." Detective Martinez hugged her as they left. "It's really over," she said quietly. "No," Eleanor replied, watching her children waiting by the car, thinking of her students at the community college, the support group she ran, the lives she might still help save. "It's not over. It's just beginning." The evening news would show clips of Margaret and Charles being led to separate prison transport vehicles, their new lives of confinement beginning. But they also showed Eleanor walking away from the courthouse, surrounded by family and supporters. Her face serene, her step light, a woman who had faced death and emerged stronger, who had turned betrayal into triumph. 1 year later, Eleanor's garden bloomed with life. Vegetables and healing herbs had replaced the poisonous flowers, and her grandchildren delighted in helping her tend the new growth during their frequent visits. The garden had become a symbol of her transformation, from survival to thriving. The Eleanor Thompson Senior Safety Act had just passed in 3 states, requiring enhanced background checks in retirement communities and establishing better protections for elderly residents. Eleanor had testified before state legislatures, her quiet strength and clear voice commanding attention from lawmakers who might have otherwise overlooked the vulnerability of seniors to domestic predators. Her support group had grown into a national network with chapters in retirement communities across the country. They called themselves the Silver Survivors, and their mission extended beyond just protecting seniors from abuse. They advocated for independence, for second chances at life, for the recognition that age didn't equal vulnerability. The community college course she taught was now part of a certified program for senior safety. Eleanor had expanded it to include financial literacy, digital security, and emotional well-being. Her students ranged from seniors protecting themselves to caregivers learning to spot warning signs of abuse. Detective Martinez still visited regularly, not just as a friend, but as a colleague. They worked together on training programs for law enforcement, teaching officers how to recognize and investigate crimes against the elderly. Eleanor's case had become a template for handling similar investigations. Sarah had given birth to another child, a girl they named Eleanor Grace. "For the two strongest women we know," Sarah had explained, nodding to both her mother and Grace, who had become like a second mother to the family. The baby's arrival marked a new chapter of joy in their lives. The media occasionally still sought interviews, especially when similar cases emerged, but Eleanor was selective about her appearances. She chose to focus on educational opportunities rather than sensationalizing her story. Her blog, Living Fearlessly After 60, had become a respected resource for seniors and their families. Charles and Margaret's appeals had been denied. Margaret's case had led to the reopening of dozens of suspicious deaths in retirement communities, bringing closure to families who had never known the truth about their loved ones passing. Charles spent his days in prison, writing letters of apology that Eleanor never read. She had moved beyond the need for his explanations or remorse. On the anniversary of the verdict, Eleanor hosted a garden party. The guests included Mrs. Carlton, Grace, Detective Martinez, her children, and many others who had supported her through the darkest times. They celebrated not just survival, but revival. "A year ago," Eleanor told her gathered friends, "I thought I was merely escaping death. I didn't realize I was actually finding life. Each of us has more strength than we know, more life to live than we imagine, and it's never too late for a new beginning." Her words resonated with many present who had found their own courage through her example. Several of her bridge club friends had made major life changes, pursuing delayed dreams, ending unhappy marriages, starting new careers despite their age. The sun was setting as her guests departed, casting long shadows across her transformed garden. Eleanor sat on her porch, sipping tea without fear, watching the golden light play across the flowers. Her phone buzzed with a message from a woman in Florida who had recognized the warning signs in her own marriage thanks to Eleanor's blog. "Another life saved," Eleanor murmured, smiling as she typed a response. She had learned that healing wasn't just about recovering from trauma. It was about using that experience to light the way for others. As darkness fell, Eleanor looked out over her garden one last time. The poisonous blooms were long gone, replaced by plants that nourished and healed. Like her garden, she had transformed, not just surviving, but flourishing. In fighting for her life, she had found her purpose. In exposing darkness, she had discovered her own light. Eleanor switched on her porch light, illuminating the path for any other survivors who might need to find their way to safety. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. She was ready for all of it, this 74-year-old warrior who had turned betrayal into triumph, trauma into testimony, and near death into vibrant life.